With multiple and sometimes unreconciled and even unreconcilable theories and descriptions recognized as admissible alternatives, our conception of truth calls for re-examination. And with our view of world-making expanded far beyond theories and descriptions, beyond statements, beyond language, beyond denotation even, to include versions and visions, metaphorical as well as literal, pictorial and musical as well as verbal, exemplifying and expressing as well as describing and depicting. The distinction between right and wrong versions can no longer be identified with the distinction between true and false ones, for only statements have truth value. What standard of rightness, for example, is the counterpart of truth for works without subjects that present worlds by exemplification and expression? I shall have to approach such forbidding questions rather circumspectly. In my title on rightness of rendering, both rendering and rightness are to be taken rather generally. Under rendering, I include not just what a draftsman does, but all the ways of making and presenting worlds in scientific theories, works of art, and versions of all sorts. I chose the term to counteract any impression that I shall be discussing moral or ethical rightness. Under rightness, I include, along with truth, standards of acceptability that sometimes supplement or even compete with truth where it applies, or that replace truth for non-declarative renderings. Although my main interest here is in these other standards, I must begin by clarifying briefly certain points about truth. In the first place, if we encounter such sentences as, one, some of you, if you have paper and pencil, may want to jot these down. I'll have to refer to them once or twice by number. I'll try to put those on the board that I'm going to refer to most often by number, but it's a little cumbersome. In the first place, if we encounter such sentences as, one, the earth stands still, and two, the earth dances the role of Petrushka. If we encounter these sentences in a true-false quiz, we unhesitatingly mark them false. In a different context, or on a more sophisticated level, we may rather say that these have no truth value as they stand, that they take on different truth values relative to different frameworks, that truth or falsity attaches primarily and more constantly to such more complete statements as, 3, in the Ptolemaic system the earth stands still, and 4, in the Stravinsky-Fokine system the earth dances the role of Petrushka. But while we tend to say that choice of framework determines facts, this suggests reversion to the untenable notion that frameworks are fabricated and chosen, while facts are there to be found. Rather, fixation may be either upon a particular fact or upon a broader background of facts that we call a framework. Sometimes we have to find consonant facts given a framework. Sometimes we have to find a consonant framework given a fact, given one or more facts. A guard was once ordered to shoot any prisoner who moved. He immediately shot all the miserable, immobile captives and explained that they were moving rapidly around the Earth's axis and around the sun. One may mistake either facts or frameworks. In the second place, while relativization of sentences like 1 and 2, that's the one, the earth stands still, the earth dances the role of Petrushka, Well, relativization of these sentences resolves ambiguities of truth value. It can be rather too effective a device, sometimes riding roughshod over the truth value of statements it operates on. Presumably, for example, one but not the other of the following statements: 5, the kings of Sparta had 2 votes. 6, the kings of Sparta had only 1 vote. Presumably, one but not the other of those is true. Yet the following statements, 7, according to Herodotus, the kings of Sparta had 2 votes, and 8, according to Thucydides, the kings of Sparta had only 1 vote, are both true, irrespective of the truth of the sentences included here. While the following 2, and the following 2, 9 and 10, are simply reversing Thucydides and Herodotus, they're both false. Now this case differs from the former one about the Earth's motions, in that while 1 and 2 may be regarded as incomplete sentences without truth values, that is, we could say, to say the Earth stands still or the Earth moves in such a way that these are incomplete statements, we need to complete them. 5 and 6 have opposite truth values, obviously. That the king of Sparta had 2 votes, the kings of Sparta have 1 vote. There's nothing incomplete about those statements as they stand. One is true, one is false, whether or not we know which. So this case is somewhat different. And accordingly, while the Ptolemaic and Stravinsky-Phokine versions are compatible and even intertranslatable, the Herodotus and the Thucydides versions conflict with each other. But that the cases are alike in that both the truth of the amplified statements is independent of the truth of the initial statements. I'm sorry, there's something wrong there. But the cases are alike in that in both, the truth of the amplified statements is independent of the truth of the initial statements. That such and such is the case according to a given version is entirely non-committal as to whether such and such is the case and as to whether the version is true. Now compare with these cases a third, suggested by our discussion of apparent motion. I see a moving spot that physics says is not there. Take the initial statements now as 11. The spot moved along path P through time t. And 12, no spot so moved. As before, these initial statements are ostensibly at odds, and we are inclined to expand them to 13. According to perception, a spot so moved, and 14, according to physics, no spot so moved. Now the question I want to raise is this case more like the first case about the Earth's motion, or is it more like the second case about the kings of Sparta? If we suppose, along with some physicalists and some phenomenalists, that the physical and perceptual versions are intertranslatable, or that one is reducible to the other, the case is like that of the Earth's motion. 11 and 12 can be repeated, 11 and 12 can be treated as incomplete sentences without their own truth values, as sentences that need the addition of the relativization to perception or to physics to take on truth value. And they are, in 13 and 14, relativized to different but compatible versions. The trouble here is the gratuitous and implausible assumption that these two versions, as well as the versions of every other similarly contrasting pairs can be fully translated into or reduced to the other in any non-trivial way. Now, if we suppose rather, with materialists and idealists, that one of the two versions is true, that is, either a spot moved along that path at the time or no spots are moved, and one of them is true and the other is false, this case is like the second, like the case of the kings of Sparta. The conflict between the versions, and also between 11 and 12, is between what is true and what is not. But thus to regard either 11 and 12 as, or 12 as false, 11 and 12 are the statements about the moving spot, deprives us of any distinction between true and false perceptual, or else between true and false physical statements. That is, if we take the position of the idealist or the materialist that, well, all these statements about perception are false, or all these statements about physics are false, then what are we investigating when we investigate perception or when we investigate physics? This destroys the distinction between true and false within the rejected field. Suppose then, as relativists, we instead treat the two versions, and hence 11 and 12 also, as true though irreconcilable. Now we have a dramatically different situation, where truth of a statement does not preclude truth of its opposite. If this seems hard to take, reconsider the drawbacks of the other treatments considered, and notice that even Quine, a logician and a die-hard physicalist, has written recently that he believes that there are true alternatives that cannot be reconciled, empirically true alternatives that cannot be reconciled. It's a striking statement for a logician. Since if you get two statements that can't be reconciled, with a little logic, you can get almost anything else out of that. However, I'm quoting it with approval, not with disapproval. Within physics, perhaps, we seem to have somewhat the same thing in the wave theory and the particle theory, which, although I don't know much physics, might be thought of as two unreconciled theories that are both true and used together. I'm not going to argue about that example with any physicist that might be here. Conflicting truths, however, are hardly in any reasonable sense versions of the same world. A world complying with both would not only be non-actual, but impossible. Even some of my most friendly enemies might balk at that. We stop the quarreling between such versions by assigning each to its own sphere. They are versions of different worlds. But is calling them different worlds perhaps going too far? Why not spheres or domains or regions or zones or parts of the world? Well, which words we use for describing what is, after all, simply a relationship between versions perhaps does not matter much. But our choice may be guided by how well the realms fit together into a well-organized and well-recognized whole. The conflict between everything is north of the equator and everything is south of the equator is removed by confining each statement to its own hemispherical part of the familiar unit Earth, not thus combining neatly into one the perceptual and physical realms we tend to count as worlds. Well, these few observations concerning truth will serve as a preface to our inquiry about standards applicable where truth is not, where no declarations are made. Before we make any attempt to formulate general standards of rightness, of rendering, or world-making, or even of any non-denotational or non-verbal versions. Let's look at some familiar kinds of rightness that do not depend on truth value. First, let's turn from veracity to validity. Among the most explicit and clear-cut standards of rightness we have anywhere are those for the validity of a deductive argument. And validity is obviously distinct from truth, since a valid argument may have false premises and false conclusion. Validity consists of conformity with rules of inference, rules which codify deductive practice in accepting or rejecting particular inferences. Deductive validity, however, though different from, is not altogether independent of truth. Deductive validity relates statements which have truth value, and so relates them that valid inference from true premises must give a true conclusion. And of course the purpose of valid inference is primarily to relate truths to truths. So while we have a kind of rightness here which is not truth, it's still intimately connected with truth. Furthermore, validity is not the only requirement upon a deductive argument. A deductive argument is right only if the premises are true and the inference is valid. Rightness of deductive argument is thus closely allied to truth, though it also involves validity. Well, next, consider inductive validity. As with deductive validity, true premises and true conclusion are neither necessary nor sufficient conditions of inductive validity. And inductive validity, again, consists, like deductive validity, I would say, consists in conformity with principles that codify inductive practice. But inductive validity is one step further removed from truth than is deductive validity. For valid inductive inference from true premises need not yield a true conclusion. Inductive rightness, like deductive rightness, does require truth of the premises, but also requires something more. In the first place, a right inductive argument must be based not only on true premises, but upon all the available genuine evidence. Arguments to a hypothesis from a true statement of positive instances, such arguments are not right if negative instances available are omitted. The argument must proceed from the results of all the examined instances. There is no parallel completeness requirement upon a deductive argument. It is right if it proceeds validly from any true premises, however incomplete, and it will then yield a true conclusion. This point, incidentally, is urged by C.I. Lewis in a little book that he wrote called The Ground and Nature of the Right. His main objective there is quite different from mine. He wants to reach a conception of moral or ethical rightness, but he does emphasize this point. However, he overlooks, I think, a second point, which is equally important, that deductive rightness is not fully characterized as inductive validity plus use of all examined instances. If all examined instances have been examined prior to 1977, the argument that all instances whatever will be examined prior to 1977 is still obviously inductively wrong. And even if all examined emeralds have been GRU, still the inductive argument to the hypothesis that all emeralds are GRU is wrong. Inductive rightness requires that the evidence statement and the statements and the hypothesis are in terms of genuine, or there's some quotes around these, genuine or natural kinds, or in my terminology, that they be in terms of projectable predicates, like green and blue, rather than in terms of non-projectable predicates like blue, grew, and bleen. Without such a restriction, right inductive arguments would always be found to yield countless conflicting conclusions. That all emeralds are green, all are grew, all are red, and so on, which gives the result that emeralds are, you'll find that future emeralds are going to be blue and red, and so on. In sum, then, inductive rightness requires that the argument proceed from true premises, from all true premises that report on examined instances, and that are in terms of projectable predicates. Thus, inductive rightness, though still tied to truth of premises, involves a great deal more. And yet, though we hope by means of inductive argument to arrive at truth, inductive rightness, even when all these conditions are satisfied, unlike deductive rightness, still does not guarantee truth. That makes a great difference. In the case of deduction, a deductive argument is wrong, and its inferences can be rejected as invalid if it leads to a false conclusion from true premises. But an inductive argument may be valid and right in all respects, and yet give a false conclusion from true premises. This vital difference has led to some frantic and futile efforts to justify induction, in the sense of showing that right induction will always, or more often than not, yield true conclusions. Any justification of induction, I think, must consist rather of showing that the rules of inference are suitable codifications of inductive practice, with mutual adjustment between rules and practice, and showing that projectable predicates, or inductively right categories, are being used. This leaves us, though, with the question, what are inductively right categories? And thus turns our attention to a third kind of rightness in general. We've considered, after truth, deductive validity, inductive validity. Found inductive validity involves rightness of categorization, and now we'd have to look at what this means. Such rightness is even one step further removed from truth, for while deductive and inductive rightness still have to do with statements, thus with elements having truth value, rightness of categorization attaches to categories or predicates or systems thereof which have no truth value. So you see, what I'm trying to do is to approach some of these difficult questions about standards for certain kinds of symbols or versions by examining cases, familiar cases, where we have standards of rightness that are progressively further and further removed from their relationship to truth. Just what distinguishes right inductive categories, that is, projectable predicates, from others? Well, I can do no more than indicate the nature of the tentative reply I've outlined elsewhere. The primary factor in projectability is entrenchment. Where there is that is the habituation of the predicates, the fact that the predicates are familiar, that they're used in these contexts constantly. Where there is a conflict, the decision normally goes to the better habituated category. Yet there obviously must be room for progress, for the introduction of novel organizations that make possible and take account of newly important connections, for the introduction of novel organizations that make possible and take account of newly discovered important connections and distinctions. Inertia is modified by innovation, by inquiry, by invention. The formulation of principles based on these factors that in effect define projectability is an intricate and delicate task. Inductively right categories tend to coincide with categories that are in general right for science and in practice, though variation in purpose may result in variation in relevant kinds. Sometimes the choice among categorizations, like the choice among frameworks for the description of motion, may be a mere matter of comfort and convenience. After all, we can translate our investigations, which involve green and blue, into grue and bleen, if we want to. This won't do any harm, as we can translate heliocentric into geocentric systems. But notice that the blue-green categorization is right and the grue-bleen categorization wrong when it's taken to provide the lines along which we make our inductive inference. Here, the difference between the two becomes not a matter of comfort and convenience, but a matter of rightness or wrongness. Here, the penalty for using the wrong categories is no mere matter of convenience, or no more a mere matter of inconvenience than was the guard's choice of the wrong framework of reference, a matter of mere inconvenience to the slotted captives. As I noticed earlier, we can be wrong about a categorization or a framework, or about a particular fact within a framework or a categorization. Induction according to unprojectable categories is not merely awkward, but is wrong. Every so often, some critic of one of my writings says something, will complain somewhat the following way, quotes, Goodman states without argument that so-and-so and so-and-so. Particular example I remember is someone writing, quotes, Goodman states without argument that the core of representation is denotation, close quotes. Well, this made me stop and think and reflect on why I should make such a crucial declaration without argument. And the reason is that argument in any sense of inference from premises would be utterly inappropriate here. I am not in such cases stating a belief or advancing a thesis, a doctrine, or a statement. Rather, I am proposing a categorization, a scheme of organization, calling attention to a way of setting our nets to capture important likenesses and differences. Any argument for the categorization, the schema suggested, could not be for its truth, for it has no truth value, but for its efficacy in world-making and understanding. The argument would consist of such directions or indications as see how representation and verbal denotation are alike. Notice the obscurities and confusions that are clarified by this association. Observe how this organization works with other aspects of the theory of symbols. This would be the kind of so-called argument for it. I'm not arguing for any statement, for categorical system is no statement and has no truth value to be argued for or against. Rather, I am attempting to show what it can do. If you want to put it crassly, what is appropriate in such cases is not so much arguing as selling. To repeat, rightness of categorization is a matter not of truth, but of efficacy, where inquiry rather than practice is concerned, of efficacy in providing illumination and insight. Well, so far we have been considering rightness where truth is inapplicable, and cases that are progressively more and more independent of truth. But we have kept to the realm of the linguistic or verbal. What of such nonverbal cases as pictorial representation? When is a representation right? The usual answer, which like most usual answers is wrong, is that a representation is right just to the extent that it resembles its subject. The shortcomings of this version have been so fully set forth in the literature as to make any discussion here superfluous. Correctness of representation, like correctness of description of the motions of bodies in the solar system, is relative to a system or framework. Is the picture correct is much like the question, does the earth move? A picture drawn in reverse or otherwise distorted, quotes, perspective, or a picture that replaces colors by their complementaries, can be as correct under that given system as what we ordinarily consider a realistic picture is under standard conventions of Western representation. But there are further dimensions of the rightness of representation beyond correctness relative to a system. If rightness of representation is to be taken as embodying realism, we must note two different senses in which we may say that a picture is realistic. According to the most frequent usage, a picture is realistic to the extent that it is a correct representation under the accustomed, the usual, the everyday system of representation that we're used to. Thus, in present Western culture, a picture by Dürer is more realistic than a picture by Cézanne. Realism or rightness of representation in this sense involves use of the habitual, the entrenched framework. But when a painter makes or discloses to us new aspects of a world, aspects we had overlooked, we may say that he has achieved a new degree of realism, in the sense that he has discovered and presented what we term new aspects of reality. This, of course, is not realism in the sense of habituation, but realism in the sense of revelation. Notice, though, that these two senses reflect the same factors that we saw operating in the concept of rightness of induction and categorization. Entrenchment or inertia on the one hand, modified by inquiry, invention, innovation on the other. Roughly speaking, rightness of representation, like rightness in those other applications, consists of an adjustment between these two factors. This brings us to the question of the standards of rightness for purely abstract works that not only have no truth value, but do not denote or depict anything. Rightness here will incorporate such matters as rightness of design. And we are invading a region that has been kept sacrosanct as the province of beauty rather than of any sort of rightness that is in any way comparable to truth. That would seem to me to sacrifice the very continuity and unity, the very affinity of art and science and perception as branches of world-making that is one of my basic theses. Rightness of abstract works, or of the non-denotational aspects of non-abstract works, is neither identical with nor alien to truth. But they are like truth, species of a more general notion of rightness. To say that beauty is truth or that it is incomparable with truth seem to me equally unhelpful slogans. And I mention them only, and I mention beauty at all only to exclude it from further consideration, since it would otherwise inevitably intrude. So back to the main course of our inquiry. We saw that abstract works that do not declare or denote anything may nevertheless make, embody, present worlds by exemplification. Well, what constitutes rightness or wrongness of such exemplification? When is a sample right? To begin with, just as a predicate or label may be wrongly applied to an object, for example, the term red is mistakenly applied to a completely green object, so the object may be a wrong sample in that it's not even an instance of a predicate or label applied, that it doesn't possess that property. All right, that's merely a preliminary. In the second place, something may be an instance of a predicate or a property without being a sample of it, as we saw in the case of the Taylor swatch. That is an instance, after all, of a certain size and shape, but not, because the swatch does not refer to that size and shape, not a sample of these features. More interesting, though, is the question whether what are samples of a feature, may some of them be right and some of them wrong. That is, whether just as classifying objects under a certain categorical scheme may be correct in that the predicates assigned do apply, while that categorization, for instance, one into Grew and Bleen, is wrong. Here perhaps we should look at the notion of a fair sample. We distinguish in common parlance between not being a sample at all and being a sample but not being a fair sample. In what sense, then, is a swatch cut from a bolt of cloth and used as a sample of it? In what sense can it be not a fair sample? For one thing, it may be too small to show the pattern. Or it may be cut in such a way as not to show full relevant elements of the pattern. Or to take a different sort of case, in the case of a sample of grass seed, of a grass seed mixture, the sample may not have the different kinds of seeds in the same proportions as they are in the barrel of which it's a sample. Now, what is involved here? Two different principles seem to be at work. First, take the cloth. Suppose this is a ball of plaid cloth. Now let's consider sample A. This is sample A. Sample B is sample B is, well, it's two over here. Sample B is this. Sample D is this. Sample D is that. And sample E is this. Well, I think, and I don't especially want to argue about it, I think that a rough intuitive grading might rate A through D as samples of decreasing unfairness, but as unfair samples, with only E qualifying in any way as a fair sample. If you don't like the examples, you can change them. I mean that clearly there's a difference of fairness among this group. We might propose to disqualify A through D as samples at all on the ground that a sample must possess the property exemplified. Remember that. And that these samples do not possess the pattern or design property of the bolt. But then, does E or any sample possess the design property? The design property is a somewhat ambiguous word, isn't it? What is the pattern of the bolt? Well, if you're going to be meticulous about it, perhaps it consists of 36 of these squares along the breadth and several hundred along the length. And then no sample that you take is going to present that property. Even E doesn't have this, of course, so how does E qualify as a fair sample while D doesn't? Obviously, if we accept that criticism, then we're never going to get any fair samples. Before we try to answer that, let's look at the seed example. There are two different ways we might formulate the criterion for being a fair sample of the mixture. First, that the mixture in the sample is in the same proportions as in the barrel. And second, the alternative formulation is that the sample is fairly drawn from the barrel is well mixed, the sample is made up of smaller specimens taken without prejudice from different parts of the barrel, and so on. Now, a sample may be fair in both these senses, or in neither, or in one but not the other. What is clear is that the first sense fails to cover a wide variety of cases where the notion of a fair sample needs to be used. That is, the definition that says the mixture in the sample is the same as the mixture in the barrel isn't very practical in a great many cases. Of course, if we know the properties, the proportions of grass in the barrel, then we can make a fair sample in that first sense just by mixing a sample in the same proportions. And fair sample in this sense, samples in this sense do have their uses. But more often, a sample is used as a means for discovering or determining the composition of the whole. For example, when we take samples of drinking water or seawater and so on, we can't reject a sample taken as not a fair sample because we are not sure that it has the same composition as the whole. Here we do not know, though we hope that the sample is fair in the first sense. But we cannot determine that as a way of telling whether our sample is fair in the second sense. What are the criteria then of fairness in this second, more elusive and more important sense? How do we know the sample is fair, or how do we decide the sample is fair when we don't know what the property of the whole is, but in fact are trying to use the sample to judge that property? If we take this case, this more elusive case, the more important case for the seed mixtures, along with the case of the swatches, what becomes evidence is that fairness of the sample consists of our appraisal of the reliability of the judgment of the relevant property of the whole from the sample. We cannot have the whole pattern of the bolt in the sample. We rate a sample as fair if we suppose the pattern of the bolt can be judged from the sample. If we do not know the composition of the seed in the barrel, we judge the fairness of the sample on similar grounds, on how it was taken. There are indeed differences in the two cases. Fairness in the second case has to do with the way the sample is taken. Fairness in the second case, fairness in the second case of the seeds, that is, has to do with the way the sample is taken. Fairness in the first case is judged by less obvious means, by whether we take the fragmentary pattern to give us the basis from which we can proceed to the pattern of the whole. But what governs that judgment of fairness? Well, what must already be very evident is that we have something very much like the projection of predicates in induction. The fairness of a sample, where the property of what is sampled is not already known, is a matter of projectability of the pattern or other sample properties from the sample to the whole. On the basis of experience, of entrenchment, whatever you like, some of these samples, one of these samples rather than the others, we feel we can project, we can get a picture of the pattern, so to speak, the important aspects of the pattern of the whole bolt. The Schwartz that is a fair sample is the one that enables to project the pattern of the bolt. But what determines that when we don't know the pattern of the bolt? The basic factors, again, I'm afraid to say, is entrenchment, habit. To leave the swatches and the seed and come back to our abstract works of art. They exemplify form, patterns, feelings. The rightness of such works, or is their fairness as samples. They are right to the extent that we can project what they exemplify, that we can see the world, or rather make and remake it, in terms of the features these works exemplify. And such projectability of a world, such projectability onto a world, of what such works exemplify, is a matter, again, of habit as modified by inquiry, of inertia and innovation, of seeing in familiar ways and learning how to see in modified ways. This is the nature of rightness in these cases. There is a standard, and of course it is variable. We are used to hearing about how variable and therefore subjective are standards in the arts. I am suggesting that the variability and the constancy is of much the same sort as in science and in practice, that in all these cases the standards of rightness derive from the joint operation of the two factors of holding the line and seeing beyond it, and that the rightness of description, of induction, of categorization, of representation, and of design, indeed of rendering in general, is thus fundamentally of one sort. All this, obviously, is the merest beginning of the task I envisage, and what I have covered has been in the sketchiest and most general terms. The elaboration of careful criteria all along the way, the explication of parallels and generalizations of such notions as conflict and implication, etc., for nonverbal, non-literal, and non-denotational versions, calls for painstaking work. And the bearing upon the nature of truth and of knowledge needs to be explored. If knowledge is determination of rightness rather than merely of truth, and moreover of rightness of all sorts, even where truth is irrelevant, knowledge, or perhaps we should say understanding, is by no means confined to arriving at beliefs, but involves the fabrication of facts and worlds, the invention of schemata, the discernment of distinctions and affinities, the finding of fit. Like Andrew Marvell, I wistfully and counterfactually contemplate the delights, quotes, had we but world enough and time, close quotes. Though my trouble is a shortage of time, but a plenitude of world. In closing, let me express my warmest thanks for an audience that is perhaps the most attentive, alert, responsive, and friendly that I have ever met.
We'll have an opportunity to ask Professor Goodman some questions as before, but we'll have a break of a minute or two first.
But it seems to me that there might be other comparisons that might be equally apt or maybe apt. And it seems, and I'd like to suggest one that you might perhaps want to comment on. It seems to me that the different samples here, different more or less unfair samples here, are very much like different responses to a question, to a WH question, who, what, when, etc. And the analogy then would be that the unfair samples would be only partial answers from some of these samples. In other words, in this example, somebody could tell only partially what the whole pattern is like. Whereas from some sense, from a fair sample, you can tell it like it is. And this would be the analogy. And what struck me especially forcefully here was that, as I tried to show elsewhere, in terms of this question-answer relationship, appropriately analyzed, one can distinguish between degree of objective satisfactoriness of an answer or partial answer from its subjective satisfactoriness. And this seems to be especially close to your example about taking a sample in a statistical sense versus constructing a sample to match a known composition of, say, some chemical substance.
Yes, I think this is quite true. There is this analogy here. The thing that I want to avoid in both cases, of course, is the idea that we proceed from a sample which is almost completely unfair to one which is totally fair, which, however, is identical with the thing sampled. I mean, it seems to me that we have to find ways of saying that we have a fair sample at some point, even where it still involves a good deal of projection and construction to the total thing.
So this would be a different analogy and would probably lead to a different kind of answer to some of your further questions.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you Nelson about the problem of rightness and wrongness. And we take something, for example, a clearly not meant to be representational piece of music. Now, I don't see how the sampling problem is going to help very much in deciding or in establishing or getting a view of the rightness of a particular piece of music. I wondered if I...
Yeah. If you have to look back to some of the early lectures, in the first place, it is something of a jump to suppose that you have in even an abstract painting without a subject, that you have an embodiment or a presentation of the world, you see. And that I went into by exemplification. Then I raised very briefly the question about music and said you can have a presentation of the world not only auditorily but visually through music, because patterns and properties are not confined to one medium necessarily. And if there is a question of rightness of design in music, and I think there is, I think it certainly develops theories and so on, but I think there is, just as there is a question of rightness of design in painting, then I think that the kind of complaint that a person would make, a critic would make, or a person would make, when a certain musical pattern is presented to him is, I can't hear anything that way, I can't grasp the pattern, I can't project this pattern onto anything, this seems to me wrong. Now, of course, this is a highly subjective judgment, as many scientific judgments are. The sort of situation, I mean, this is not, I mean, that's as good an answer as I can give to that question at the moment. The kind of thing that happens that I was going to use an illustration, and I might make here. You have, let's say, up to the time of Degas, you have some standard rules of composition and things like that. And then you suddenly see a picture of his, something like this, where there's a figure the main figure is over here, looking out this way, which violates any kind of, it just looks plain wrong. Because after a time, we begin to adapt, we begin to see design in this way. I mean, this is like the introduction of new predicates and so on. There's a good deal of amorphous material to be settled here. I mean, I can't do any better than that.
One thing that worries me a little bit about the way you've spelled out criteria of rightness is that in art, it seems to me, there's a lot of, for reasons that are not always quite clear to me, but there's a lot of premium set on novelty. If somebody wrote today a symphony that was just like Beethoven's 10th, so to say, or a play like Shakespeare, we wouldn't regard it, we wouldn't appreciate it as much as the original, even if it wasn't somewhat similar. And I was wondering that if the analogy with rightness would be things like entrenchment and therefore habit and so on, it wasn't clear to me how you account in your theory for this feature of art, this kind of...
Well, I said, remember, there are two factors always in contention, inertia and innovation, novelty and so on. Now, this emphasis on novelty in the arts, it's true, there is a lot of it, some of it specious, some of it not. But don't forget that there's a terrific emphasis on novelty in science. Now, the people who say, all right, all the scientists, all I want to do is to discover truth. Okay, sit him down with an adding machine or anything else, and he can discover new truths on end. I mean, lots of other standards apply here. Not that those results are wrong here, but I'm just now illustrating that there are other considerations. And as a matter of fact, the scientist much rather discover, fabricate a law which doesn't really hit any of the data, but sort of approximates some of them, but is nice and smooth and new and so on, then he would like to create a million sums and so on. So that I think novelty is always a value.
Do you think there's a connection, if you think there is, what is it, between finding a version to be right and being pleased by it?
No. I mean, I think that obviously there are satisfactions in making discoveries ordinarily, whether it's in science or art, anywhere. And how well we're pleased by it depends on a lot of things. I mean, whether it's really nice and novel and so forth and so on, or whether it's can be. I mean, a discovery, we can find a discovery which sort of upsets other things that we have, which isn't very pleasant. I'm not really concerned with I'm trying to get away from the judgment of these things in terms of pleasure, beauty, etc.
Do you think there is just an internal, do you think the connection is just accidental between the fact that something, a version seems right and one gets some satisfaction from it? You said obviously there are satisfactions. Is that fact just accidental, or is there internal connection or something?
I guess all connections are accidental. I'm concerned. I think the important point, the thing I would want to stress is that the kind of, you see there's the time theory says, well, we do science to discover truth, but art is for the sake of pleasure and so on. And this seems to me just plain nonsense. In the first place, there's no value in truths as such. They have to have other aspects to be important. And if there weren't satisfaction in discovering such truths and so on, nobody'd do any science. On the other hand, if there were satisfaction, if satisfaction were the primary aim, either in science or art, nobody'd do any science either very well, I don't think. I mean, if they're concentrating on the satisfaction rather than on the subject matter in their inquiry, then they're not going to be very good scientists, and they're not going to be very good artists either.
We've got a question back
Yes, I believe that you've spoken both of rightness of design and rightness of aversion.
Yeah.
Do you distinguish these in any regular way?
No,
Would you be willing to add, say, a third, for example, rightness of execution?
no, I wasn't distinguishing. I was saying that when we have abstract painting, and when these abstract paintings are in one way or another making or presenting or embodying, exemplifying a world, that their rightness in so doing amounts to what one might call, at least one of the things it amounts to, is what one might call rightness of design. I was not saying there are two different kinds of things here. I was saying rightness of design is a kind of term that we might apply in those cases, just as we say rightness of portrayal is a feature of representational rightness.
Which is then a variety of rightness aversions?
Well, it's rightness with respect to the representational function of a symbol. And rightness of design, I'd say, is rightness with respect to the exemplified formal characteristics of it.
Could you sort of speak about how your sample business applies to the expressive qualities of the work of art?
In the first place, I can say a little. In the first place, sampling, exemplification, is the core of expression. The difference between straight exemplification and expression, so far as I'm concerned, is that in the one case, what you exemplify is a property or a predicate that is literally of the thing, whereas the other, it's metaphorically so. That's the difference. If something is taken as a sample of squareness or texture, then it's just exemplification. If it's taken as an example of feeling comfortable or being happy or something like that, and we're talking about material things, then it's exemplification of a metaphorical property, and this I call expression.
To what extent would you accept the idea of information as a kind of measure common to our works of art and scientific theories? And if not, why not?
Well, because I should think information on the whole, depending on your concept of information. Information I think of as something which gets embodied in statements, and these things don't. In other words, look, how would you translate into terms of information the rightness of a good categorization, like green blue is against group lean, or like a good ornithological classification. So I don't see how this is a matter of information.
In case of music, for a performance to be a fair sample of a score, does it require that the performance exhibit all the structural properties?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that a performance was ordinarily a sample of a score. Anyway, I mean, it's something which complies with the score. It's an instance of, but I wouldn't say it was a fair sample. It isn't a sample of the score. No, because it couldn't be a sample of the score because it has to have the properties that it exemplifies, you see.
Would it be more difficult to judge the rightness of work of art if it were created at least partly or totally by random means?
I don't think it would matter how it was done. I mean, I don't think the way it's made affects its quality or its efficacy.
In other words, it's still a version of,
Yeah.
exemplifies a version of the world.
Yeah.
But there's
Yeah.
no intention.
Yeah, I'm not admitting intention.
Maybe I'm not understanding you correctly, but when you talk about frameworks and worldviews, do you mean to say that the only way is to pick a worldview is on matter of habit or aesthetics? I mean, there's no other way of choosing?
None. Well, there are a lot of things. I mean, of course, which framework is right in a given case? I mean, the God had the wrong framework, obviously. Which framework is right depends on all kinds of circumstances in a given case. Now, which framework is sort of, in a more general sense, right, I suppose depends on its more general, it's being right in many sorts of cases and so forth. So, you see, this is what we mean by it's being well entrenched. I mean, why green and blue classification rather than green and green? I don't know of any way of explicating this, except that in terms of entrenchment modified by very elaborate rules to allow change and innovation.
The same thing goes for art.
That's what I'm suggesting here. You see, when I began this with the question, well, here we have all these different kinds of versions and so on, and what in the world sort of standards apply? Because we don't, all this liberalism about the kinds of media and the kinds of symbol systems that can be used has to be accompanied by a refusal to give up the distinction between the right and the wrong. And what are the standards of right and wrong? And as I began to look at, I mean, the paper actually reflects the course of my inquiry, because then I said, well, look, let's see where we can find standards that we do recognize very well, which are not standards for truth. And then as you begin to examine them, I was impressed by the fact that in representation, see what I'd concluded about representation independently and what I'd concluded about induction independently seem to have these common properties, and these seem to be applicable to the more remote case. Okay.
Thank you.